The Mannequin, A Story of the Strange Ending of a Long Professional Partnership, by John D. Swain. To Upshaw, the young ambulance surgeon, the novelty of his vocation had not yet worn off. Each combat with death was still an adventure. He still cherished the dream in which most young medicos indulge, the rush to the bedside of a dying magnate, the bold decision and steady hand that dragged the patient back to life. The only child, an heiress, a lovely maiden, sobbing her gratitude out upon his shoulder. True, it was never more than a daydream. In cold fact, the patient might be a stricken reveler who had looked upon the alcohol when it was wood, or a broken tenement drudge fallen beside her washtub, or a child run down by a car, but never anybody having both a lively gratitude and a live bank account. There remained only the thrill of anticipation, the zest of conflict with the Dark Angel. Now, as he entered the room 3 flights up in a cheap Hanover Street lodging house, Upshaw knew that not here was his vision to come true. The room was small, and its one window looked through bleared panes into a disconsolate backyard, lacking so much as a single blade of grass. Only a sickly ailanthus tree served as a clothes pole on which hung the wet wash of many races. The room was papered in a pattern of crimson orchids on a background of poisonous green. Upon it hung a single-colored print of a gauze-draped vamp, clinging to a cross of artificial rock, while wooden-looking waves swept over her shapely legs. The dirty brown carpet was worn threadbare between the speckled iron bed and the washstand. Above the latter hung a cracked mirror, and upon its oilcloth cover were many cigarette stubs. There was also a wrecked Morris chair. From 3 or 4 rusty hooks screwed into the wall hung the shapeless garments of the man who lay upon the bed, his eyes closed, and only the slight rise and fall of his chest indicating that he still lived. Close at Upshaw's heels was old Benny, with his white canvas stretcher. He had been an orderly before Upshaw had put on long trousers, and he knew things that many successful nurses and physicians did not suspect. Just inside the doorway stood the frowsy landlady, her eyes and nose running, her bony red hands twisting the damp apron to which a scared child clung. "Hooch or dope?" Upshaw asked her curtly as he passed. "No, he's just been laying that way all day. He's been sickly for a long spell." Nevertheless, Upshaw's first act was to sniff at the patient's breath, and his next to apply the stethoscope. At its touch, the eyes fluttered open. The doctor took note of the pupils. After a moment, he turned his head in the direction toward which the dying man was staring, and thus he came to observe the mannequin. Sprawling in the room's one chair, its shrunken arms and legs outflung, was the figure of a puppet, the size of a boy of 10, provided that the boy were a dwarf. Its great wooden head was topped by a shock of fiery red hair with a sailor's hat. Its painted face was faded and scarred, only the eyes remained bright and clear. They seemed to be fixed with a stare of unspeakable malice upon the countenance of the dying man. The puppet's wooden lips grinned impishly. The hinged lower jaw hung loose. "A ventriloquist he was, and they say one of the best in his day. Garford the Great he was billed." Upshaw nodded. He had seen the act, or others precisely like it, a score of times. The ventriloquist would be seated in a chair with the mannequin on his knee, a saucy boy with a dirty tongue. The man would speak in fatherly wise, the mannequin would come back with an impudent retort that earned a small cuff on the ear. The dummy always won out in the dialogue, to the delight of the gallery, but the man mauled and shook and pounded him into a raging, tearful little beast. The lips of the sick man moved. "Team's going to break up, Doc. 40 years. Garford the Great." His eyes and lips closed. The soil blanket rose to a deep inhalation, sank, and thereafter seemed to move no more. Upshaw turned to speak to old Benny. The orderly did not wait for the imminent command, but swiftly crossed to the washstand and fetched a glass of tepid water, into which Upshaw dashed aromatic spirits. The liquid ran down the unshaven chin of Garford the Great, its pungent odor stealing through the room. The young doctor next produced a hypodermic syringe. He glanced sharply at the tallow-hued features, now oddly pinched and bleak, and hesitated. At this instant, the familiar climax of scores of such occasions, a singular interruption startled the four who beheld Garford, no longer great, taking his last curtain call. From the lips of the mannequin, or so it seemed, a high-pitched nasal voice mocked the inert form whose bloodless face its painted eyes were fixed in sinister triumph. The voice was astonishingly loud and strong. disturbingly so, in that squalid little chamber of silence. The dialect was the old familiar lingo of the passive partner of Garford the Great.
"You've croaked now, damn your eyes, and you can't have no more sport with me. I'm sorry for you, not worth a fight, 'cause you're going to hell and I'll have a bloomin' good long rest. Didn't I support you for more than 40 year, and pay for your booze and women and swell togs, and you put words in my mouth, and then bashed me, silly head off, for saying of 'em. And after the show, what then? Why, you slammed me into a stuffy box while you barged up and down the streets like a toff. You put so many bloomin' thoughts in my wooden head that some of 'em stuck there. I growed a soul of sorts, just enough to supper with. I've been waiting for this hour, to see you croak and go to hell, where you jolly well belongs. I don't care what becomes of me now. They can sell me to the ragman, or give me to the kids for a football, but you'll never make a fool out of me no more, governor.
The voice trailed off in a whining diminuendo of unprintable epithets. 2. The landlady's brat had screamed once, and then had buried his head in his mother's apron. Her own face, a sickly yellow, she had uttered no sound, but, having swiftly crossed herself once, had stood with her stricken eyes set upon the ugly, scarred wooden face of the mannequin, which seemed to gloat upon the dead man over whom young Upshaw bent. As the strident voice died away, the surgeon straightened and motioned to old Benny. "No need for the ambulance," he murmured. "I'll notify the coroner. Let's get out of here." He drew the soiled sheet over the face of Garford the once great, hesitated an instant, and then passed around the foot of the cot to where, silent now, the mannequin sprawled in the chair. Upshaw set his teeth, extended an arm, and, clutching the thing by its baggy jacket, hurried out into the hall and down the dark well of the staircase. Halfway down, he paused to light a cigarette, scratching the match on a wall defaced in every conceivable way. At his shoulder, old Benny's face hung luminous and yellow in the murky light. "It fair give me a turn, it did," the orderly complained. "Queer how their minds run in the old grooves at the last, doing his turn just as he'd give it 1,000 times. Upshaw waited until the match burned clear and touched the flame to the end of his cigarette. "It was queerer than that, Benny," he said. "Huh? How do you mean, queerer?" Upshaw inhaled a lungful of smoke and expelled it. "I mean that when the voice spoke, the man Garford was dead." Old Benny's eyes popped wide. "Oh, come now, Dr. Upshaw. You know, and so do I, that it ain't easy to tell just when they snuff out. I've seen 'em sit up and ask for a drink, or where was they after they'd been pronounced good and dead? Any undertaker can tell you a string of stories." Upshaw interrupted him brusquely. "As you know so much, do you happen to know this? That the trick of ventriloquism requires a powerful effort of the lungs, as powerful as that of a man running a marathon race. No man with his lungs still functioning like that was ever declared dead by a medical freshman." He dropped the cigarette upon the stairs and ground it with a heel. "There's another thing, which you may keep to yourself, do you hear? I was sure he was dead when the thing began to speak, but just because of that 1,000-to-1 chance that there was a spark of life left, I covered his mouth tight with my palm. Tight, I tell you. So tight that I felt his teeth through the lips, and the voice went right on as clear as before. "God," whispered old Benny as they moved on downward along the twisting stairway. "What are you gonna do with it?" he asked after a moment. Upshaw answered through clenched teeth. "I'm going to the cellar to burn the damned thing up," he said.
The Marmoset, by Mark L. Shorer and August W. Dearlith. The dark figure of a man slunk silently through the byways and alleys of Florence. He kept to the clutching shadows, avoiding the moonlight as much as possible. Once, when he unwittingly stepped into a bright patch of light, the rays of the moon beamed brightly on something visible below the belt of his doublet. But he hastily drew back into the shadows, and the gleam vanished. Once he halted and listened attentively, because he thought he had heard a sound. But it was only a cat. Again, a bat swept by him in the darkness, and he shuddered, and it flew out into the moonlight, and wheeled about in the calm summer air, casting a grotesque shadow upon the paving stones in the patch of light. He watched it, fascinated. A moth whirred out of its retreat into the moonlight, and before he quite grasped the rapidity of the thing, the man saw the bat sweep downward, and the moth was no longer there. He smiled in secret admiration of the feat. Like a bat, he would accomplish his objective under the sheltering robe of night. He glanced eagerly down the street. A single, feeble, illuminated window greeted his gaze, but it was a window in a house to which he was directed. He fumed impatiently and glanced up at the moon, which was already starting its descent into the westward. For quite some time he stood there in the shadows. Monsieur Mary was late in retiring, but no matter, the watching man could attain his objective, if wait he must until morning. The window was dark now, but he must bide his time and give the magician a space in which to fall into slumber. There was no doubt that it was Monsieur Mary who had bewitched his daughter, and now she was gone. His hand wandered to the hilt of his dagger, and he grasped the weapon to make certain that it was still firmly in its place. What was it he saw in the door of the magician's squat residence? He gazed intently at it. It was naught else but the figure of the wizard leaving the house and starting down the street. Monsieur Como watched the magician silently and wondered where he could be going. Suddenly he was seized with the idea of entering the house and secreting himself therein in Monsieur Mary's absence. He slunk forward again, and soon he was pushing at the door of the house. It yielded to his touch, and Monsieur Como entered. There was a patch of moonlight on the floor, and Monsieur Como searched for a hiding place. He noticed glowing embers in the grate, and wondered for what Monsieur Mary had needed a fire on such a warm night. Something shot across the patch of moonlight, and a second later Monsieur Como felt it brushing against his legs. A cat, perhaps. He reached downward and struck the furry mass. At his action, the injured creature started to glimmer demonically. It was gone now, and sat in the moonlight, shaking its tiny furry fist at Monsieur Como. It was a marmoset, and its big eyes caught and reflected the moonlight as it blinked them furiously at Monsieur Como. Monsieur Como went over to it, and attempted to pacify it, but his efforts only served to increase the fury of the little beast. It glimmered incessantly, and Monsieur Como apprehensively wondered how quickly Monsieur Mary would return. For a minute he considered dispatching the animal, but then he thought better of it and drew back into the shadows, leaving the marmoset to itself. For a short space the creature remained silent, and Monsieur Como was about to breathe a sigh of relief, when it again started to clatter more vehemently than before, and at the same time Monsieur Como heard a step resound in the court without. He half unloosed his dagger, and felt his other weapon in the bosom of his doublet. The marmoset glimmered shrilly, and jumped up and down on the stone floor in its anger. The door opened, and Monsieur Mary entered. He halted at the threshold and stared at his pet. "Ah," he said, "something has disturbed my little pet. Is it not so, Chiro?" He walked over to the candles in the brackets. "Perhaps," he continued, "perhaps we have a visitor." He removed a candle and walked over to the fireplace. "We shall see, Chiro, in a space." He lit the candle at the embers, and, without glancing around him, walked to the sconce and ignited the remaining flambeau. He turned, and his eyes fell upon Monsieur Como standing quietly near the entrance, his hand guiltily clutching the hilt of the dagger. The magician glanced at the marmoset. "You see, Chiro, I was correct. We have a visitor." The animal blinked solemnly back at him, and at intervals it gibbered excitedly. Monsieur Mary continued. Sit down, Monsieur Como, sit down. I am sure that your intentions are the best, even though your hand rests upon your dagger. Possibly a habit, Monsieur Como? Most probably a habit. He turned to the animal on the floor again. It is most fortunate that he comes, eh, Chiro? The creature moved forward and caught at Monsieur Mary's robe, and in a few seconds it was perched upon his shoulder. In a monotone, Monsieur Mary spoke a few words to his pet. The monkey jumped to the floor and raced over to Monsieur Como, and almost before Monsieur Como was aware of it, the marmoset was running off with his dagger. But he contented himself with the thought that he still had another dagger, in the form of a stiletto, in the bosom of his doublet. The wizard addressed Monsieur Como. Yes, Monsieur Como, it is so fortunate that you have come. I am so in need of someone to aid me. It is kind of you, he smiled sardonically. Monsieur Como strove to answer, but he was totally unnerved by the calm of his would-be victim. Yes, Monsieur Como. Today I have compounded 2 liquids, both poison. One should kill within a quarter hour, the other not for 2 months. I am very much in need of someone to test these for me, monsieur. He smiled, but the glint in his eyes belied the smile. He continued. First, I think we shall try the more deadly of the 2. He moved over to a shelf near the fireplace, from which he removed 2 phials. Meanwhile, Monsieur Como sat. He uttered not a sound, but stared at the magician, fascinated. All his plans of vengeance had dissolved into thin air, and his one thought was escape from this fiend who threatened his existence. He was seated near the open door, but Monsieur Mary's marmoset, which was between him and the door, was fingering the dagger it had stolen, and once in a space it glared evilly at Monsieur Como. Undoubtedly the animal could not kill, but even a scratch from the weapon would suffice to dispatch one, for Monsieur Como had taken the precaution to dip the end of the blade into a deadly compound. The window, as a means of escape, was far too distant. Dully he watched the wizard at his task of removing the phials. Monsieur Mary walked over and stood before him. He held aloft a phial and spoke. This, Monsieur Como, is the more deadly. The liquid was as colorless as the glass that contained it. A drop, monsieur, or 2 drops, will plunge you into the most excruciating pains you can experience. While you will not be conscious of any exterior pain, you will nevertheless suffer most horribly. He uncorked the phial as he spoke. First, Monsieur Como, there will be a terrible burning feeling as the liquid travels down the gullet. But that, monsieur, is naught compared to the gnawing pain in the vitals. 1,000 times you will wish yourself dead. 1,000 times you will regret that you had ever been born. Then, monsieur, it will attack your brain in a most subtle manner. All you will see will appear a bright, glaring red, and suddenly you will go blind. He looked at Monsieur Como suggestively. Monsieur Como's forehead was covered with a cold sweat of terror. But, continued the wizard, if I should see that the poison is beginning to take effect, I shall possibly give you a few drops of a mixture which I have concocted to counteract its effect. Possibly, monsieur. The ominous accent on the word possibly did not escape Monsieur Como's notice. And, monsieur, if you but taste the other liquid, here he removed the stopper of the remaining phial, you will wish to be back in the tortures of the first poison. The first poison is merciful in comparison to the latter. For 2 months, monsieur, you will live upon a rack. Everything you touch will seem like hot coals. Everything you eat will taste like putrefied flesh. But enough of my inadequate description. You shall see for yourself. Monsieur Como seemed to have shrunk in his clothes, for he sat immobile, staring at the marmoset that had defeated his purpose. The magician was advancing toward him, the phials containing the fatal poisons grasped firmly in his hands. But at that moment, the wizard's pet leapt away from the door. With a hoarse cry, Monsieur Cuomo flung himself into the court without. Calmly, the magician poured the water and the phials out upon the flagstones at the threshold. He stood in the doorway and chuckled exultantly to himself, the marmoset clinging to his doublet, as he watched Monsieur Cuomo run swiftly down the street. It was simple, he reflected, so simple to play upon this man's imagination. He had come to murder him, had he? The wizard laughed. Poison? He had none in his residence, for that very day the Duc de Medici had purchased his entire stock. He laughed again and stared after Monsieur Cuomo, almost out of sight down the long street. But the fury of Monsieur Cuomo was too much for him to contain, so he halted, half-turned, and saw the magician standing in the doorway. In the space of a second, Monsieur Cuomo had formulated a plan. He left the center of the street and melted into the shadows on the side. He grasped the stiletto in his bosom. The blade of this tool had been poisoned. So Monsieur Mari would poison him, eh? Well, he would show him. He would give him a generous taste of his own medicine. Hidden in the shadows, he crept toward the magician's house. He was close enough now. He could easily reach the wizard with his weapon from where he stood. He drew the stiletto from his doublet and, raising his arm, threw it with all his strength, then turned and fled fleetly down the street. There was a brilliant flash in the moonlight, a shrill, piercing scream, and the magician crumbled to the flagstones before his house. For days afterward, people wondered at the significance of the cold body of the magician with the stiff marmoset impaled to his breast by the long-bladed stiletto.
Perdita by Hildegard Hawthorne. 1. Alfalfa Ranch. Alfalfa Ranch, low, wide, with spreading verandas, all overgrown by roses and woodbine, and commanding on all sides a wide view of the rolling alfalfa fields, was a most bewitching place for a young couple to spend the first few months of their married life. So Jack and I were naturally much delighted when Aunt Agnes asked us to consider it our own for as long as we chose. The ranch, in spite of its distance from the nearest town, surrounded as it was by the prairies, and without a neighbor within a 3-yard radius, was yet luxuriously fitted with all the modern conveniences. Aunt Agnes was a rich young widow, and had built the place after her husband's death, intending to live there with her child, to whom she transferred all the wealth of devotion she had lavished on her husband. The child, however, had died when only 3 years old, and Aunt Agnes, as soon as she recovered sufficient strength, had left Alfalfa Ranch, intending never to visit the place again. All this had happened nearly 10 years ago, and the widow, relinquishing all the advantages her youth and beauty, quite as much as her wealth, could give her, had devoted herself to work amid the poor of New York. At my wedding, which she heartily approved, and where to a greater extent than ever before she cast off the almost morbid quietness which had grown habitual with her, she seemed particularly anxious that Jack and I should accept the loan of Alfalfa Ranch, apparently having an old idea that the power of our happiness would somehow lift the cloud of sorrow which in her mind brooded over the place. I had not been strong, and Jack was overjoyed at such an opportunity of taking me into the country. High as our expectations were, the beauty of the place far exceeded them all. What color, what glorious sunsets, and the long rides we took, seeming to be utterly tireless in that fresh, sweet air. One afternoon I sat on the veranda at the western wing of the house. The veranda here was broader than anywhere else, and it was reached only by a flight of steps leading up from the lawn on one side, and by a door opposite these steps that opened into Jack's study. The rest of this veranda was enclosed by a high railing, and by wire netting so thickly overgrown with vines that the place was always very shady. I sat near the steps, where I could watch the sweep of the great shadows thrown by the clouds that were sailing before the west wind. Jack was inside, writing, and now and then he would say something to me through the open window. As I sat, lost in delight at the beauty of the view and the sweetness of the flower-scented air, I marveled that Aunt Agnes could ever have left so charming a spot. She must still love it, I thought, getting up to move my chair to where I might see still further over the prairies. And sometime she will come back. At this moment, I happened to glance to the further end of the veranda, and there I saw to my amazement a little child seated on the floor, playing with the shifting shadows of the tangled creepers. It was a little girl in a daintily embroidered white dress, with golden curls around her baby head. As I still gazed, she suddenly turned, with a roguish toss of the yellow hair, and fixed her serious blue eyes on me. "Baby," I cried, "where did you come from? Where's your mamma, darling?" And I took a step towards her. "What's that, Sylvia?" called Jack from within. I turned my head and saw him sitting at his desk. "Come quick, Jack! There's the loveliest baby!" I turned back to the child, looked, blinked, and at this moment Jack stepped out beside me. "Baby?" he inquired. "What on earth are you talking about, Sylvia dearest?" "Why, but," I exclaimed, "there was one. How did she get away? She was sitting right there when I called." "A baby?" repeated my husband. "My dear, babies don't appear and disappear like East Indian magicians. You have been napping and are trying to conceal the shameful fact." "Jack," I said decisively, "don't you suppose I know a baby when I see one? She was sitting right there, playing with the shadows, and it's certainly very queer." Jack grinned. "Go and put on your habit," he replied. "The horses will be here in 10 minutes. And remember that when you have accounted for her disappearance, her presence still remains to be explained. Or perhaps you think Wah Sing produced her from his sleeve." I laughed. Wah Sing was our Chinese cook, and more apt, I thought, to put something up his sleeve than to take anything out. "I suppose I was dreaming," I said, though I could almost as well believe I had only dreamed our marriage. "Or rather," observed Jack, "that our marriage had only dreamed us." 2. Shadows. About a week later, I received a letter from Aunt Agnes. Among other things, chiefly relating to New York slums, she said, "I am in need of rest, and if you and Jack could put up with me for a few days, I believe I should like to get back to the old place. As you know, I have always dreaded a return there, but lately I seem somehow to have lost that dread. I feel that the time has come for me to be there again, and I am sure you will not mind me." Most assuredly we would not mind her. We sat in the moonlight that night on the veranda, Jack swinging my hammock slowly, and talked of Aunt Agnes. The moon silvered the waving alfalfa, and sifted through the twisted vines that fenced us in, throwing intricate and ever-changing patterns on the smooth flooring. There was a hum of insects in the air, and the soft wind ever and anon blew a fleecy cloud over the moon, dimming for a moment her serene splendor. "Who knows?" said Jack, lighting another cigar. "This may be a turning point in Aunt Agnes's life, and she may once more be something like the sunny, happy girl your mother describes. She is beautiful, and she is yet young. It may mean the beginning of a new life for her." "Yes," I answered. "It isn't right that her life should always be shadowed by that early sorrow. She is so lovely and could be so happy. Now that she has taken the first step, there is no reason why she shouldn't go on." "We'll do what we can to help her," responded my husband. "Let me fix your cushions, darling. They have slipped." He rose to do so, and suddenly stood still, facing the further end of the veranda. His expression was so peculiar that I turned, following the direction of his eyes. Even before his smothered explanation of "Sylvia, look there," reached me, standing in the fluttering moonlight and shadows, was the same little girl I had seen already. She still wore white, and her tangled curls floated shining around her head. She seemed to be smiling, and slightly shook her head at us. "What does it mean, Jack?" I whispered, slipping out of the hammock. "How did she get there? Come," said he, and we walked hastily toward the little thing, who again shook her head. Just at this moment another cloud obscured the moon for a few seconds, and though in the uncertain twilight I fancied I still saw her, yet when the cloud passed, she was not to be found. 3. Perdita. Aunt Agnes certainly did look as though she needed rest. She seemed very frail, and the color had entirely left her face, but her curling hair was as golden as ever, and her figure as girlish and graceful. She kissed me tenderly, and kept my hand in hers as she wandered over the house and took long looks across the prairie. "Isn't it beautiful?" she asked softly. "Just the place to be happy in. I've always had a strange fancy that I should be happy here again some day, and now I feel as though that day had almost come. You are happy, aren't you, dear?" I looked at Jack and felt the tears coming to my eyes. "Yes, I am happy. I did not know one could be so happy," I answered after a moment. Aunt Agnes smiled her sweet smile and kissed me again. "God bless you and your Jack. You almost make me feel young again." "As though you could possibly feel anything else," I retorted, laughing. "You little humbug, to pretend you were old." And slipping my arm around her waist, for we had always been dear friends, I walked off to chat with her in her room. We took a ride that afternoon, for Aunt Agnes wanted another gallop over that glorious prairie. The exercise and the perfect afternoon brought back the color to her cheeks. "I think I shall be so much better tomorrow," she observed as we trotted home. "What a country this is, and what horses!" Slipping her hand down her mount's glossy neck. "I did right to come back here. I do not believe I will go away again." And she smiled on Jack and me, who laughed, and said she would find it a difficult thing to attempt. We all three came out on the veranda to see the sunset. It was always a glorious sight, but this evening it was more than usually magnificent. Immense rays of pale blue and pink spread over the sky, and the clouds, which stretched in horizontal masses, glowed rose and golden. The whole sky was luminous and tender, and seemed to tremble with light. We sat silent, looking at the sky and at the shadowy grass that seemed to meet it. Slowly the color deepened and faded. "There can never be a lovelier evening," said Aunt Agnes with a sigh. "Don't say that," replied Jack. "It is only the beginning of even more perfect ones." Aunt Agnes rose with a slight shiver. "It grows chilly when the sun goes down," she murmured, and turned lingeringly to enter the house. Suddenly she gave a startled exclamation. Jack and I jumped up and looked at her. She stood with both hands pressed to her heart, looking. "The child again," said Jack in a low voice, laying his hand on my arm. He was right. There in the gathering shadow stood the little girl in the white dress. Her hands were stretched toward us, and her lips parted in a smile. A belated gleam of sunlight seemed to linger in her hair. "Perdita!" cried Aunt Agnes, in a voice that shook with a kind of terrible joy. Then, with a stifled sob, she ran forward and sank before the baby, throwing her arms about her. The little girl leaned back her golden head and looked at Aunt Agnes with her great, serious eyes. Then she flung both baby arms round her neck and lifted her sweet mouth. Jack and I turned away, looking at each other with tears in our eyes. A slight sound made us turn back. Aunt Agnes had fallen forward to the floor, and the child was nowhere to be seen. We rushed up, and Jack raised my aunt in his arms and carried her into the house, but she was quite dead. The little child we never saw again.
The Fearsome Touch of Death by Robert E. Howard. As long as midnight cloaks the earth with shadows grim and stark, God save us from the Judas kiss of a dead man in the dark. Old Adam Farrell lay dead in the house wherein he had lived alone for the last 20 years. A silent, churlish recluse, in his life he had known no friends, and only 2 men had watched his passing. Dr. Stein rose and glanced out the window into the gathering dusk. "You think you can spend the night here, then?" he asked his companion. This man, Fulred by name, assented. "Yes, certainly. I guess it's up to me." "Rather a useless and primitive custom, sitting up with the dead," commented the doctor, preparing to depart. "But I suppose it's common decency we will have to bow to precedents. Maybe I can find someone who'll come over here and help you with your vigil." Fulred shrugged his shoulders. "I doubt it. Farrell wasn't liked, wasn't known by many people. I scarcely knew him myself, but I don't mind sitting up with the corpse." Dr. Stein was removing his rubber gloves, and Fulred watched the process with an interest that almost amounted to fascination. A slight, involuntary shudder shook him at the memory of touching these gloves. Slick, cold, clammy things, like the touch of death. "You may get lonely tonight, if I don't find anyone," the doctor remarked as he opened the door. "Not superstitious, are you?" Fulred laughed. "Scarcely. To tell the truth, from what I hear of Farrell's disposition, I'd rather be watching his corpse than have been his guest in life." The door closed and Fulred took up his vigil. He seated himself in the only chair the room boasted, glanced casually at the formless sheeted bulk on the bed opposite him, and began to read by the light of the dim lamp which stood on the rough table. Outside, the darkness gathered swiftly, and finally Fulred laid down his magazine to rest his eyes. He looked again at the shape which had in life been the form of Adam Farrell, wondering what quirk in the human nature made the sight of a corpse not only so unpleasant, but such an object of fear to many. Unthinking ignorance, seeing in dead things a reminder of death to come, he decided lazily, and began idly contemplating as to what life had held for this grim and crabbed old man, who had neither relatives nor friends, and who had seldom left the house wherein he had died. The usual tales of miser-hoarded wealth had accumulated, but Fulred felt so little interest in the whole matter that it was not even necessary for him to overcome any temptation to pry about the house for possible hidden treasure. He returned to his reading with a shrug. The task was more boresome than he had thought for. After a while he was aware that every time he looked up from his magazine, and his eyes fell upon the bed with its grim occupant, he started, involuntarily, as if he had, for an instant, forgotten the presence of the dead man, and was unpleasantly reminded of the fact. The start was slight and instinctive, but he felt almost angered at himself. He realized, for the first time, the utter and deadening silence which enwrapped the house, a silence apparently shared by the night, for no sound came through the window. Adam Farrell had lived as far apart from his neighbours as possible, and there was no other house within hearing distance. Fulred shook himself as if to rid his mind of unsavoury speculations and went back to his reading. A sudden vagrant gust of wind whipped through the window, in which the light of the lamp flickered and went out suddenly. Fulred, cursing softly, groped in the darkness for matches, burning his fingers on the hot lamp chimney. He struck a match, relighted the lamp, and glancing over at the bed, got a horrible mental jolt. Adam Farrell's face stared blindly at him, the dead eyes wide and blank, framed in the gnarled grey features. Even as Forward instinctively shuddered, his reason explained the apparent phenomenon. The sheet that covered the corpse had been carelessly thrown across the face, and the sudden puff of wind had disarranged and flung it aside. Yet there was something grisly about the thing, something fearsomely suggestive, as if, in the cloaking dark, a dead hand had flung aside the sheet, just as if the corpse were about to rise. Forward, an imaginative man, shrugged his shoulders at these ghastly thoughts and crossed the room to replace the sheet. The dead eyes seemed to stare at him malevolently, with an evilness that transcended the dead man's churlishness in life. The workings of a vivid imagination, Forward knew, and he recovered the grey face, shrinking as his hand chanced to touch the cold flesh. Slick and clammy, the touch of death. He shuddered with the natural revulsion of the living for the dead and went back to his chair and magazine. At last, growing sleepy, he lay down upon a couch which, by some strange whim of the original owner, formed part of the room's scant furnishings, and composed himself for slumber. He decided to leave the light burning, telling himself that it was in accordance with the usual custom of leaving lights burning for the dead, for he was not willing to admit to himself that already he was conscious of a dislike for lying in the darkness with a corpse. He dozed, awoke with a start, and looked at the sheeted form on the bed. Silence reigned over the house, and outside it was very dark. The hour was approaching midnight, with its accompanying eerie domination over the human mind. Forward glanced again at the bed where the body lay, and found the sight of the sheeted object most repellent. A fantastic idea had birth in his mind and grew, that beneath the sheet the mere lifeless body had become a strange, monstrous thing, a hideous, conscious thing that watched him with eyes which burned through the fabric of the cloth. This thought, a mere fantasy, of course, he explained to himself by the legends of vampires, undead ghosts, and such like, the fearsome attributes with which the living have cloaked the dead for countless ages, since primitive man first recognized in death something horrid and apart from life. Man feared death, thought Forward, and some of his fear of death took hold on the dead so that they too were feared. And the sight of the dead engendered grisly thoughts, gave rise to dim fears of hereditary memory, lurking back in the dark corners of the brain. At any rate, that silent hidden thing was getting on his nerves. He thought of uncovering the face, on the principle that familiarity breeds contempt. The sight of the features, calm and still in death, would banish, he thought, all such wild conjectures as were haunting him in spite of himself. But the thought of those dead eyes staring in the lamplight was intolerable. So at last he blew out the light and lay down. This fear had been stealing upon him so insidiously and gradually that he had not been aware of its growth. With the extinguishing of the light, however, the blotting out of the sight of the corpse, things assumed their true character and proportions, and Forward fell asleep almost instantly, on his lips a faint smile for his previous folly. He awakened suddenly. How long he had been asleep he did not know. He sat up, his pulse pounding frantically, the cold sweat beading his forehead. He knew instantly where he was, remembered the other occupant of the room. But what had awakened him? A dream. Yes, now he remembered. A hideous dream in which the dead man had risen from the bed and stalked stiffly across the room with eyes of fire and a horrid leer frozen on his grey lips. Forward had seemed to lie motionless, helpless. Then as the corpse reached a gnarled and horrible hand, he had awakened. He strove to pierce the gloom, but the gloom was all blackness, and all without was so dark that no gleam of light came through the window. He reached a shaking hand toward the lamp, then recoiled as if from a hidden serpent. Sitting here in the dark with a fiendish corpse was bad enough, but he dared not light the lamp, for fear that his reason would be snuffed out like a candle at what he might see. Horror, stark and unreasoning, had full possession of his soul. He no longer questioned the instinctive fears that rose in him. All those legends he had heard came back to him and brought a belief in them. Death was a hideous thing, a brain-shattering horror, imbuing lifeless men with a horrid malevolence. Adam Farrell in his life had been simply a churlish but harmless man. Now he was a terror, a monster, a fiend lurking in the shadows of fear, ready to leap on mankind with talons dipped deep in death and insanity. Fulred sat there, his blood freezing, and fought out his silent battle. Faint glimmerings of reason had begun to touch his fright when a soft, stealthy sound again froze him. He did not recognize it as the whisper of the night wind across the windowsill. His frenzied fancy knew it only as the tread of death and horror. He sprang from the couch, then stood undecided. Escape was in his mind, but he was too dazed to even try to formulate a plan of escape. Even his sense of direction was gone. Fear had so stultified his mind that he was not able to think consciously. The blackness spread in long waves about him, and its darkness and void entered into his brain. His motions, such as they were instinctive. He seemed shackled with mighty chains, and his limbs responded sluggishly, like an imbecile's. A terrible horror grew up in him and reared its grisly shape, that the dead man was behind him, was stealing upon him from the rear. He no longer thought of lighting the lamp, he no longer thought of anything. Fear filled his whole being. There was room for nothing else. He backed slowly away in the darkness, hands behind him, instinctively feeling the way. With a terrific effort, he partly shook the clinging mists of horror from him, and, the cold sweat clammy upon his body, strove to orient himself. He could see nothing, but the bed was across the room in front of him. He was backing away from it. There was where the dead man was lying, according to all rules of nature. If the thing were, as he felt, behind him, then the old tales were true. Death did implant in lifeless bodies an unearthly animation, and dead men did roam the shadows to work their ghastly and evil will upon the sons of men. Then, great God, what was man but a wailing infant, lost in the night and beset by frightful things from the black abysses and the terrible unknown voids of space and time? These conclusions he did not reach by any reasoning process. They leaped full grown into his terror-dazed brain. He worked his way, slowly, backward, groping, clinging to the thought that the dead man must be in front of him. Then his back-flung hands encountered something. Something slick, cold, and clammy, like the touch of death. A scream shook the echoes, followed by the crashing of a falling body. The next morning, they who came to the house of death found 2 corpses in the room. Adam Farrell's sheeted body lay motionless upon the bed, and across the room lay the body of Fulred, beneath the shelf where Dr. Stein had absent-mindedly left his gloves. Rubber gloves, slick and clammy to the touch of a hand groping in the dark, a hand of one fleeing his own fear. Rubber gloves, slick and clammy and cold, like the touch of death.
Soul Catcher by Robert S. Carr. The delicate netting in the big frame began to flutter as if something had gotten tangled up in it. Soul Catcher by Robert S. Carr. Around the hospital, folks said that John Dorsey was a nice old man, kind of puttery, but still a mighty good all-around M.D. He was small and mild and chubby and had soft white hair, the sort of kindly old man you see telling stories to the kiddies in the park. Old John had his ways, too. Peculiar, maybe, but harmless. He was unobtrusive and fitted well into the general scheme of things around the hospital. Unobtrusive, that is, except when an emergency case came in. Old John was an emergency specialist. The ambulance boys would bring him in, screaming, moaning, or something huddled up in a silent, blood-stained heap under the stretcher covers, and rush them into old John's emergency parlors, as one of the young college interns used to term it. The ambulance boys would sometimes call me in from the orderly room to help them with some poor devil who had gotten more than his share of hard luck at the grade crossing smash. At these times, I noticed that old John wasn't the same as he generally appeared to be. He would flash into action as quickly as any first aid man in the front line trenches ever did. Old John had his own operating room, and as he didn't have much else to do, he always kept things in readiness for the emergency cases. The water in the sterilizing basins was always gently simmering over the sharp, wicked-looking things with which he did his wonder work. The bandages, the antiseptics, and the sponges were always laid out in readiness on a long table which he kept close to his side while operating. Here is where old John's peculiarity cropped out. He would not use an assistant or have any person in the room. The moment he heard the ambulance siren, and he always heard it before any of the rest of us did, he would hurry to his room, and by the time we had the howling unfortunate stripped and laid out and under the ether, old John would know what the trouble was and be ready and waiting to begin. "Clear out of here," he would say good-naturedly, "but stay close around outside the door where I can tell you if I need you." Only he never seemed to need any help. But, after all, there wasn't so much use for an assistant in the kind of emergencies we handled. The very messy cases often died in the ambulance boys' arms, much to their disgust, and the poison cases were taken care of with a stomach pump on the way to the hospital. The majority of old John's patients required only to have a shutoff jammed on a squirting artery, or a splintered bone yanked out of some vital organ in a hurry. Seems like with just me and the patient in there by ourselves, with no fool girl to get pale and shivery and act heroic, and everything right where I can reach it, without having to ask for it or fall over somebody, I can do my best for the patient in the least time, and that's what counts. So spake old John, and no one disagreed. One time McCarty said something kind of queer about old John. McCarty's the slim young doctor who wears the thick horn-rimmed glasses and smokes so many cigarettes. It was when some Italian window washer did an 11-story nosedive to the pavement and smashed himself up. He didn't look very bad, though, so the ambulance boys rushed him to old John. Anybody with any sense at all would have known the wop would cash it inside 5 minutes. But since an MD's business seems to be taking nothing for granted, old John ran everybody out of the room as usual and went to work. Pretty soon, according to McCarty, old John came to the door, shaking his head kind of sorrowful-like, and said, "Too late, boys," the way he always does. "Harumph," said McCarty, with a queer sideways look through those big glasses of his. "It does seem as if it took Dorsey a long time to find out that man was dead. And listen, Jack." He looked up and down the hall before he spoke. "Old John didn't put his rubber gloves on all the while he was in there. Must not have been examining the man." Not being as smart as some, I didn't see anything special about that to bowl anybody over, but I kept still. I wasn't there when it happened, being busy at the time on the 5th floor, sitting on the chest of some loony fever case who thought he needed an airing out on the fire escape. After the little blonde nurse in Ward 10 gave him a shot in the arm and got him quiet, she said to me, "Gee, but you're strong." and I kind of grinned, and... But as I was saying, old John sure did some wonderful things here by himself in that room. One time he took a bullet out of a fellow's head. I forgot the long names the MDs called the operation, but it made the other doctors sit up and take notice. Of course, a lot of emergency cases died, but that's why they're emergency cases, because they're dying. None of the deaths were old John's fault. Well, things went on as usual for a while, the interns and me bribing the drug room man to give us little drinks of prescription whiskey, the nurses smoking their cigarettes up in the roof garden, and the ambulance boys charging the hospital double for every tire they brought. One day along in spring, when the auto wreck cases began to pile in, old John asked me to go down to the supply room and get him a new pair of surgeon's gloves. I said I would, and while I was down there, rummaging around, I heard the ambulance siren, but didn't think anything about it. I came back upstairs with the gloves and went to old John's room. The door was closed and nobody was around. I suppose if I'd stopped to think, I would have guessed that old John had an emergency case in there, but I didn't. I went right on in. Now, working around a hospital just naturally gets you to be mighty light-footed. And with the noiseless door and the soft floor pad, I guess I must not have made a sound. Old John had his back turned and didn't hear me come in. For a moment I looked, then sank back against the wall and stared while my eyes popped out and I began to sweat. There was one of the usual busted-up fellows, all bloody and out of joint, lying on the operating table under the strong light. Over him bent old John, holding in his hands a light rectangular frame about 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. Inside the frame was stretched the queerest, webbiest, fine network I'd ever seen. The netting wasn't wire, and it wasn't thread. I don't know what it was. A big black wire ran all the way around the frame, under the handle by which old John was holding it, and into a round glass jar. The whole thing kind of reminded me of an old-fashioned indoor radio aerial. As I stood and looked, I could see that the patient was pretty far gone, but that didn't seem to worry old John. He stood very quiet, very tense, and waited. Soon the figure on the operating table quivered a little, then sighed, and went limp all over, the way they do. Right then is when the hair started to rise up on the back of my neck, for just a second after that fellow had passed out, the thin, delicate netting in the big frame began to flutter as if something had gotten tangled up in it, something you couldn't see. Then the glass jar that was hooked up to the big black wire began to fill up, just as if someone were blowing cigarette smoke into it. Only this stuff was thicker and gray-colored, not bluish like cigarette smoke. Pretty soon the net quit quivering, and the jar was filled with this smoky stuff. Old John lay down the frame on the dead man, unhooked the wire, and held the jar up to the light. "I got him all right," he chuckled to himself. I guess I must have moaned or made a kind of a noise about then, for old John wheeled quickly as a cat, and when he saw me, his eyes blazed up like a bad brain fever case's. I don't know how long we stood like a couple of stone statues staring at each other. All I know is that I felt numb and sick and paralyzed all over, the same as I did the day I got hold of the wrong bottle down in the drug room. Then, little by little, the glare died out of his eyes, till at last he set the jar down and smiled. "Here's your rubber gloves," I said kind of shakily, and turned to go. "Wait a minute," he said in his kindly soft voice, just as if nothing had happened. I stopped. The gray vapor in the jar seemed to be restless, moving. "You saw everything?" he asked. I nodded. He smiled the same way he does when he says, "Too late, boys." "Sit down," he said. "I want to talk to you." I sat down. "I get all the bad cases in here," he began, "and I do all I can for them. I work mighty hard to keep them from dying, and often do it, don't I?" Again I nodded. "And listen," he said, leaning toward me, "if I can't save their bodies, I save their souls." Seeing the look on my face, he arose and led me to a tall black cabinet in one corner of the room. Lifting out a dummy shelf of books, he pointed with pride at row after row of glass jars, all filled with a thick grayish vapor. The instant he uncovered these things, I nearly keeled over. It's a hard thing to explain, but I'll try to do it. Before I got this job, I worked behind the scenes at a big theater. Sometimes, when the stage was dark, I'd slip out to fix a set for the next scene. And from the very first, I noticed a queer sensation caused by suddenly stepping into the glare of so many eyes. I could feel the eyes of the audience out there in the dark, even though I couldn't see them. And so it was with the jars in old John's cabinet. I immediately felt that I was the target for a great many eyes. There was nothing I could see except those little jars full of something gaseous and gray. But old John closed the cabinet, and it was the same as stepping off the dark stage. The feeling of eyes was gone. "I may need an assistant sometime," he began again, "and since my secret had to be found out, I'm glad it was you and not one of those know-it-all young interns. I can depend on you keeping still about this, can't I?" There was nothing for me to do but say yes. Suddenly, the ambulance siren screamed in the distance, then screamed again, coming closer. "Another case," he breathed. "Here, get behind this screen until they have gone." I hid, and in a few moments the ambulance boys had brought in another limp, sprawling bundle and turned it over to old John. As they carried the other one out, I heard him say his customary, "Too late, boys," and add something about, "This one's going to take a lot of time." After he had locked the door, I came out of hiding. He motioned me to be still, so I stood quietly and watched him. The case on the operating table was a big, beefy, middle-aged man, his throat and shoulders horribly crushed and bloody. I marveled at old John's magic rubber-gloved fingers as they twinkled over the mangled area. He bent forward, quivering in his intensity of purpose, snatching up or flinging down an instrument like lightning, probing here, or with a fairy-like lightness of touch tying up a severed artery. Truly, old John needed no assistant. Presently, after a most painstaking final examination, he stood back and sighed, shaking his head sorrowfully. I saw his lips silently form the words, "Too late, boys." Then suddenly another light came into his eyes. A different expression gripped his face. The transformation somehow reminded me of the story I had read about a collie dog that tenderly guarded a flock of sheep by day, only to slip out and murder them by night. Old John took the big net from its place of concealment. He motioned for me to help him, and together we lifted the dying man and laid him on a long pair of hospital scales. As old John felt his pulse, he pointed at the register hand, which stood at 173 pounds and 6 ounces. He made ready his soul-trapping apparatus and held the net close over the body. In a moment, that indescribable yet definite change took place, which marks the death of an unconscious person. Old John directed my eyes to the scale hand, and I watched carefully. The hand held its mark steadily, Then, precisely as the delicate web before me began to flutter, the hand quickly dropped back 4 ounces. I sat dumbly as old John completed the capture of the soul, and stowed the jar away with the others. I had heard, had even read in the Sunday supplements, that the weight of a body decreases sharply after death, but never had I expected to have it proven to me in such an awful manner. I became dimly conscious that old John was speaking. You see, there is something definite that escapes from the body at death. That something I have in my jars, ha! But the weight of the something is quickly replaced by air, exactly on the same principle as when you submerge an uncorked bottle in water. The air bubbles out and the water rushes in. Look at the hand. I looked and saw that the body had regained the lost 4 ounces, the 4 ounces of gray nebulosity now imprisoned in the glass jar. Later, as I fled unsteadily down the corridor, I heard old John announcing sadly that it was too late, boys. The next day I came upon old John stretched on a couch in his room, oblivious to everything. I shook him gently, but he did not wake. I left him to sleep on. An hour afterward he called me in, shut the door, and went to some lengths explaining that he had been astralizing himself. The whole story didn't sound very plausible to me, this thing of leaving your body for a jaunt in spirit form. Still, I told myself, if anyone should know about that kind of things, it would be old John. To a rough, practical mind like my own, this astralizing process would seem more realistic and believable if a hypodermic syringe and a bottle of morphine went with it. But, even so, there's nothing left on earth that's ungodly and spooky enough to surprise me anymore. When they told me old John was dead, I was almost afraid to go and look at him, but I went. He hadn't been dead very long, hadn't been disturbed. He was stretched out on his old couch the same as if he were astralizing himself. But what made my knees start to give in like soft rubber was the sight of the janitor before a tall black cabinet, sweeping up the fragments of a great many small glass jars. What happened here? I asked one of the nurses weakly. Why, when the elevator motor tore loose in the attic, it shook the whole building, broke several vases in my ward, and it must have jarred those glasses out of the rickety old cabinet. What on earth old John was saving them for beats me. I had been away from the hospital all day. The more I looked at those broken jars, the queerer I felt. Pretty soon I stepped over to see old John. The MDs had his face covered up and were arguing loudly about apoplexy. I pulled the cloth down and looked at him. Ugh, I'll never forget it. It was awful. He looked as if, I can't half describe it, looked as if he had been torn to pieces from the inside, just as a light sack would break if there were a dozen big cats all trying to get out in different directions. Oh, his body was all together. It wasn't mangled, but, well, you could see that that was the way he had died. It took me quite a while to figure it out, but when I had, believe me, I didn't feel any better. I guess it must have happened like this. Old John had astralized himself, and his body was lying there without any astral or soul or spirit or whatever you want to call it. This must leave a sort of empty space, as near as I can understand. Then, when all those jars full of captured souls, or astrals, were broken and released those things inside, then I guess you'd say they, saw old John's body lying there empty. And they must have had it in for him, keeping them canned up like that. Maybe they all saw it as a chance to get a body and live again. They must have all crowded inside and taken possession of his body at once. Wonder what his astral did. Maybe they fought. Anyhow, they couldn't all occupy one body, and so... This thought is driving me crazy. The ambulance boys say I'm getting jumpy. The hospital gives me the creeps. Guess I'll see if I can't get another job.